All right. Hi, everyone. This is Udit from Prepfully. Today, we're going to be talking to Ben. Ben works as a product manager at Attentive. He's previously worked at Facebook, Abstract, Canvas, and a host of other places. He'll be talking a little bit about the craft as well as the skills needed to succeed in this craft, but also how to show you can succeed in the product craft. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Happy Friday, and thank you for inviting me on.
Cheers. Thrilled to have you on board. All right, then maybe to start, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, what you do, etc.
Yeah, I'll give you the really quick rundown of my story. I was born originally in the U.S., and then I grew up in Israel from the ages of 6 to 14. And then I went to high school and college in Florida, which is where my mom's family was based. And I studied finance in college, thinking I wanted to ultimately get into tech in some capacity, but finance seemed like a safe job that would teach me a lot of analytical, useful skills that I could apply later in some other setting. I started my career right out of college in finance and banking, and found out very quickly that I didn't like it. I found that I was operating at a level that was too abstracted away from solving problems and really kind of analyzing what other people who are actually solving problems are doing. Things like offering loans to big companies, doing M&A pitches, helping companies go public. I didn't get too many weeks on the live deal action, given that I stayed a little less than a year in finance. But the reason I wanted to get out is that I saw the people that were very successful in that investment banking world, and I didn't really find myself excited to be in their shoes, 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road. So I adjusted my trajectory and I left the finance path and became a founder. I started a company with a couple friends back in Florida, and we were trying to build something like an open table for clothing stores. You could browse inventory, make appointments, go try things on. That was the vision. The first product we ended up building after talking to a lot of our prospective customers for this kind of technology was more of a mobile CRM for boutiques. So we built an iPad app that allowed sales associates at these clothing stores to maintain some kind of visual record of what people wanted to purchase in their store, so they can send them promotions during kind of like off hours when there wasn't a lot of traffic in the stores to bring them in. That was a really good learning experience for me around customer validation, recruiting, how to build a product. I learned about just like the tech stack in general, front end, back end. I taught myself how to do some product design, which comes into play later on when I joined Abstract. And ultimately, we made the decision to shut down the company after a year and a half. We didn't raise a lot of money, so I don't feel too bad about that. We stretched about $50,000 over the course of a year and a half, which I think most founders would not believe is possible today. And ended up joining a really interesting startup back in San Francisco after shutting down my company called Life360, which is a location sharing app for families. It's now publicly traded in Australia. That's a separate story for why. And I joined Life360, really bridging a lot of gaps between QA, customer support, product management, design. And I built a lot of two-way bridges of communication between customer support that was saying all the things that are broken in the product to the product team so they could fix it. And then also serving information the other way when we were getting ready to release new features, making sure our customer support people were prepared to talk to our customers and triage issues as they come in. That's where I discovered product management, the way that you and I might think about the actual role. I worked with product managers there. I became really good friends with one of them who had also shut down his startup before joining Life360. And at that point, Life360 had raised a $50 million Series C. They were looking to hire people who had about 4 or 5 years of full-time product management experience to fill any of the openings that they had. So there simply wasn't room for me to grow into a PM role organically at Life360. So I ended up leaving there and I joined a company called Breeze. And Breeze was the Series A company that was offering Toyota Priuses to people that drive for Uber and Lyft who didn't have a car of their own. So that was a really interesting business. I joined and I spearheaded our brand new 0 to 1 fleet management tool. So we built this whole tool internally to manage our fleet of cars. A year after I joined Breeze, Ford, the car company, acquired Breeze. And we spun up a whole new business by using that fleet management tool as the back end for a business called Canvas. And Canvas was a direct-to-consumer alternative to buying or leasing a car. So rather than serving the ride-sharing market, we were serving the let's call it high credit automotive customer who didn't want to buy or lease a car. And I stayed for 2 years after the acquisition, and it was fascinating to see how a company like that, like Ford, operates this kind of new tech bet. Learned a lot about incentives and changed a lot of my views around like the role of compensation as an incentive, and like imagining working in a startup for 2 years without any equity on the table, but still getting a lot of incredible work done, I think would be counterintuitive today by a lot of Silicon Valley standards. It's like you have to give people equity, you have to give people options. So I think I learned a lot about just like management and incentive structures as part of that, but also how to operate in a very capital intensive business where you're buying these like super expensive assets, like and leasing them out to people. After, as part of that process of ramping up Canvas, we started using this tool called Abstract to actually grow our design team. So as I was kind of like moonlighting as a designer at the time while also being a PM, and I started using Abstract and started sending their team like a tremendous amount of feedback, having coffee with them. They were just down the street in San Francisco, and built a pretty good relationship with the people at Abstract over the course of about a year. And then they were finally looking to hire their first PM, and they asked me if I would like to hop on board as their first PM. So that was kind of a nice opportunity. 2 years after the acquisition, go start something new, work in enterprise, B2B SaaS. And I led the collaboration team at Abstract, building all the tools that people use to leave comments, to do design reviews, present their work to other people in some kind of design review setting.
Yeah.
So it was really fascinating dive into the way that people build and design products. And then I actually got a chance, this is in 2019, and right in front of my eyes, I felt like the entire market that Abstract was based on, which was this Sketch ecosystem of using Sketch as a design tool, kind of dissipated in front of our eyes as Figma just ate Sketch's lunch. And when I joined Abstract, Sketch was still not venture funded. They had just built this giant business all on their own, and they didn't think they needed venture funding. By the time I left Abstract, there was a full-blown war happening between Figma and Sketch had raised a lot of money, and I think Figma ultimately has won that battle. So Abstract later got sold to Adobe, kind of for parts, which was fascinating to see this giant company, with, I think they raised like a $30 million Series C when I joined, to go to being sold for parts just maybe like a year and a half, 2 years later. That's a good lesson about competition, and you shouldn't be ignoring your competition too much. And then after Abstract, I ended up landing at Facebook. So this is right as COVID was starting. There was a big layoff at Abstract, and I was one of the folks who got let go as part of the changing dynamics that we just talked about. I did consulting for a few months and landed at Facebook in June of 2020. So just a few months into the pandemic. And I joined this team that was offering guidance for small business advertisers. Very interesting experience. I had a great time at Facebook, learned a lot, and ultimately followed my desire to go back to my startup roots and came back to Attentive about a year and a half after joining Facebook. It was a promotion of sorts and a chance to go back to working on not quite the Series A, Series B stage. I think that level of risk is a little bit too high for me at this point in my life. But later stage, growth stage, very, over 1,000 employees and with a very healthy core business. So anyway, that's kind of where I am right now. I'm in New York, and I've been at Attentive for about 6 months now.
Hi, I'm Udit from Prepfully, and you're watching our Day in the Life video series. These are short conversations with folks who really know what they're talking about, all the way from craft skills to interview prep, from getting the first job to senior level career transitions. So lots of unique insights and experiences distilled into key takeaways for you. We hope you find this useful. All right, thanks for sharing. Lots basically within that journey, lots of experimentation from the smallest startup that you began and worked in, to Series A, B, C companies, to Facebook, and now to a Series E company. So plenty of experiences. So you've basically seen product in a very diverse set of ecosystems, I'd say. Tell us a little bit about what you as a PM do right now based on your learnings over the last couple of years on a day-to-day basis.
I think that the role of the PM really varies wildly based on like the stage of the company and the DNA of the company, and also I think a lot of the leadership strengths and weaknesses can change the way that product managers get leveraged.
Mm-hmm.
At Facebook, it's a very product and engineering driven company. So I'd say that the role of product managers at a place like Facebook is really to own a lot of the longer term strategy. If your team has to have like a 2-year strategy, what that means is you need to be identifying the opportunities, like why are you going to invest in things? How are you going to measure success? Why should the business keep funding your team in your area? Like these are the kinds of questions that PMs, as individual contributors at a place like Facebook, are responsible for answering. The execution of the work that gets identified is done on generally 6-month increments. So the PMs drive road mapping, but then they're pretty hands off when it comes to doing the work itself once they've provided a basic, project brief for the work. So it's like, and the project brief, and then this is kind of something I do here as well at Attentive now, but I think the project brief is probably the common denominator of every PM role that I've been a part of. And the basic idea with a project brief is that there's a unit of work that has to get done where engineers are going to build something. Designers might need to design it first if it's like a consumer facing experience or has some kind of front end elements. And the ultimate decision of like, what is the purpose of this project is really important. Like, what problem is it trying to solve? What's the goal? Who's the audience for this project in this feature set? What are the constraints that we're trying to operate within? And is there any sort of like timeline associated with this? Like, imagine just framing the context around the project as the goal of the project brief. And I think what I've observed is that in the absence of a project brief, if you just kind of assume you can go directly to an engineer or designer to say like, hey, start working on X project, it has a way of ballooning in scope or meandering off track, like almost by default. And it's no single person's fault. But it's like if the PM doesn't create the project brief, someone else has to. So I think that's kind of a lot of what I do at the tactical level right now, that I don't get more granular than that. Like I create the project brief for the things that my team works on. I am managing one other PM and he's doing the same thing with his team. And then we have, I want to say a little over 20 PMs. And generally speaking, I'd say that that's pretty universally shared responsibility. Like each PM is responsible for creating project briefs. Then I'd say there's an element that might be a little bit more intangible, but I think it's extremely critical, which is just maintaining like team health and also maintaining a culture of high performance and rigor. And I think it's hard to measure whether you do this well, but people always know. People will always know if they're on a team that feels like it's high performing or not. And the way that you know that is you can just ask them. So I spend a lot of time doing, like one-on-ones and jamming with like the tech lead on my team and the engineering manager on my team and his manager and my manager, and just trying to constantly keep my pulse on the context of like, do people see my team as a high-performing team or not? And if not, why? And what would it look like if we were a high-performing team? And I find that by just opening those conversations up, people come to see me as a trusted partner. And I think that they know they can come to me. And I think that that's a lot of the job, is just building out these like high quality feedback loops within the organization, where if people need something from your team and they're not getting it, they know they can come to you and you'll get it to them. And then it also allows you to then go and get what you need from other teams. And I think that all just, it's a nice kind of like flywheel that then results in even more successful project briefs in the future, because you've been talking to everyone and you know where the impact is, and the team gets motivated because they're working on things that they understand why they're doing it. And then when it ships, people celebrate it. So it's kind of like a lot of the job is just getting that flywheel and that system in motion.
Yeah, no, that's good perspective. So if I summarize, like maybe the first thing you referred to was just having a strategy and vision for what you want to achieve and why, and building out the relevant context so that your team can buy into the concept. But then the second one is also a culture of performance, both internally, so that there is executional rigor in the way the team does its work, in the how, so to speak, but also externally when it comes to perception, like so that people can rely on you, so that you can build the connection necessary to maybe evangelize your work and get that flywheel started, as you said, so that you can drive more impact through leveraging other people who also trust you because of your performance and rigor and the like. Good. That's uh,
Yeah. And, I would say like there's an interesting relationship between strategy and execution where people think it's kind of like one or the other, or it's like first strategy and then execution. Or my sense is that you need to have an answer for like at least the next 3 to 6 months of strategy. So I'm not saying like we're not in the point at Attentive where we can do like 2-year strategies. I think it's a little premature. We're not at Facebook scale. At Facebook, you actually could put together a 2-year strategy and live to see it through, which is fascinating. At Attentive, I'd say we're operating more in like fast growth, like hyper growth stage. So it's more like 3 to 6 months plan is probably the most you could really hope for with high confidence. And then once you have alignment around what generally success might look like 3 to 6 months down the road, you need to demonstrate that you could execute on that. And I think that I think if I had to pick over indexing on execution or strategy at this stage, I'd probably go with execution, because the best strategy in the world is going to fall flat if you can't execute on it. And I think the team needs to be able to the people need to trust that once this team knows what it wants to do, and it gets people aligned on that, that actually will deliver. And I think that the best strategy in the world where people don't trust that you can actually do it is going to just cause a lot of frustration internally, and ultimately it's going to hold people back from being like excited about working at the company.
Yeah, and I guess this is also very contextual to what stage of evolution the company is at as well. Like in Facebook, in a big company, strong revenue, bite-sized teams, relatively less reliance on any one team. So there's a bit of a safety net. In case you potentially go wrong with execution, there's opportunities to fix it further down the line. I guess in smaller companies which are venture funded, where you have like growth targets to demonstrate, you also have, it's a smaller safety net. So you want to get things right as much as possible in the first go. And if you get it wrong, then you iterate as quickly as possible into the journey of getting it right, I guess.
Theoretically, I think theoretically you want that to be true. I think in practice, a lot of startups, especially early stage startups, they have like laundry lists of things that they know that their customers want. And so there's always a temptation to just chip away at that list over time. And this is common to every friend I have that works at other startups. It's like there's a giant backlog. There's a giant list of things that people want. So what happens is you end up checking something off of that list when you ship the first version of it that's like good enough. And then any of the follow-on work that you've excluded from the initial scope usually falls to the wayside, or it has to become its own project in the future. And it's very hard to prioritize standalone follow-on work projects rather than kind of just picking up something that's like shiny new project that you could like make a press release about or something like that. So I think that's the tension, is like really where to draw the line around the initial scope of that first phase of work.
No, and I can relate from personal experience, I guess. Prepfully's backlog reads like a book right now. So picking and choosing the right battles and then figuring out how to fight those battles, I think, is the real battle rather than those individual stories that we do decide to finally focus on. So thanks for sharing that.
It might not be perfect, but one way I've found to kind of like turn those battles into more of like productive discussions is to make it less about the list itself and like the backlog and more about the problems. And I think that this is something that I started doing a few years ago, and I've continued doing it because it's been so effective. I started doing this at Canvas with our designer there, and we had too many things that we could work on. There are so many people with opinions on what they think should be worked on first, that we needed to break out of this like solution first model. So we put together like a spreadsheet with the problems that we actually think everyone cares about, and then to try to prioritize those problems. And what we found is that by just getting people in a room and putting all the like the projects and the ideas and the actual solutions aside, and focusing on, is this problem more urgent to solve than this other problem or not? And if we solve it, is it going to have a bigger impact than solving these other problems? And you can get the discussion down to problems. And if you can align on the problems, you find a lot of the issues that have to do with like, is it the right scope? Is it the right solution? Is it the right phasing, et cetera? A lot of problems become so much easier to manage once you've aligned on like the fundamental thing you're trying to solve as part of the scope of the project.
Yeah. No, it brings alignment to something, a common ground, I guess, and eliminates a lot of the noise and the nice to haves that look really interesting and important, might even be exciting to work on, which might not directly or indirectly be solving the problem. It might just be a cool checkbox to tick, for instance, and those have a habit of creeping into backlogs. So yeah, good tips. So, actually, let's move into this topic, right? So you've talked a bit about what a day to day looks like. Let's try to transition this into the actual skills that it would take, the how, so to speak, to succeed in this kind of day to day. So if you had to maybe pick three or four skills that you feel help product managers set themselves and their products up for success, what would those look like? You already alluded to one, like think of the problem, not of the solution. Don't go through the backlog of ideas, go through the backlog of the problems you're trying to solve. What else,
Yep.
for instance, would you say?
Yeah. And those, what you just mentioned about the problem, those are, anyone can do that. And they don't even need to be like skilled at it, but it's almost like that's it. That should be encouraging for people, is like, if you want to do what I'm describing, but you don't think you have the skills to do it. It's like, it's not even a skill. It's like just a thing you can do, just like brushing your teeth. Like just create a spreadsheet with problems and score them based on impact and urgency. And then you can check that one off your list. So I'd say the type of skills that I think of, which are maybe things that really take more experience to develop and practice, are one is storytelling. And what I mean is not like fantasy storytelling or something crazy like that, but very basic like stories that you can share with other people that you work with around like how you think you've gotten to where you are right now, where you think you are, and where you think you're going and why, right? Like having a fundamental narrative for that helps you make sense of your job on a day-to-day basis that you can just like share with other people serves a couple important functions in my head. One, it helps them figure out what their narrative is. And I think that can be motivating for them. And you could become the kind of person they look forward to talking to, because you're helping them like get more clarity on why the hell they're showing up here every day and doing this job. And two, if their narrative is actually better than your narrative, you can upgrade your narrative by incorporating what elements from their narrative into your narrative. And then that helps you do this again in loop. And what happens over time is you become, you no longer get surprised when you share your narrative with other people, because they're just nodding and saying that's a really good or like summary of where we are. And then they trust you that you understand where you are. And now you have the ability to influence them. You can't influence people without having their trust. And I think to be an effective product manager, you need their trust, and you need to be able to influence them, because oftentimes you're influencing people in an informal capacity. So you're not managing, like I manage one person, and I don't like, he's like the person I don't need to, I don't end up spending a lot of time trying to influence him, because we're kind of operating as peers in a lot of ways. Yeah. The real people that I need to influence are not people that report to me. They're people that are horizontal engineering partners, design partners, stakeholders, even up, like, people above me in the org chart. So that's one skill I would say, is like storytelling and being able to like really articulate where you are, and also be a good listener. If people say that they disagree with you, like really listen and try to understand what they know that you don't know. The second thing I would say is being able to explain decisions. And I think that as a product manager, you make so many decisions on a day-to-day basis. It can be big decisions, like, do we do this project or do we not do this project? And it can be what might seem like not that big decisions, like should this implementation like detail like matter or not? Does it matter or not? Right? Things that the user might never even know about, like how you're ingesting some information on the back end based on some like file upload that maybe has or does not have an additional column in it. Like, does that matter? Right? And I think trying to like be able to explain the rationale for the decisions in the moment to the people that are working on it with you is critical, because they don't want to feel like you're just like being hand wavy. Oh, let's just do it that way. It doesn't matter. Right? If it doesn't matter, explain to them why it doesn't matter, right? Like that's a decision. And if it does matter, explain to them why it does matter, and then let them know ask them if they agree with you. And then ask, like, are there any open questions that we have that if we knew the answer to, we would be able to better make this decision? And then I will go and I will get this. I will fetch down the person that can help us answer that question, and then we'll have an informed decision that we can make. I think establishing that level of like rigor around decisions within the team and just doing it consistently gets the people on your team to do that even when you're not around. And I think that's good. It also gives them permission to not feel like they have to like lie or make up answers if they don't know the answer. Like they know that if you were on the call, you'd want to say, hey, like if we're missing information to make this decision, what is that information? Let's just like call it out as an open question, get an answer, and then make the decision, right? It's not a big problem. So that's one thing. And then I'd say, like, when you zoom out and think about more of that like external trust building and, again, like influence in the organization, you want to be seen as someone who always has rationale for the decisions that you make. So that if you come forward with some kind of idea or a proposal or a new initiative, they know it's coming from, like, this guy must have already thought about it. Like, he's very thoughtful. He or she is very thoughtful. They've already, like, I know that they have a track record of always communicating their thinking around decisions in a very clear way. So that's another skill set. Those are just a couple that comes to mind, is like storytelling and like being able to really communicate like the rationale and the thinking around decisions.
No, but that's actually that's extraordinarily helpful, because these are the sort of tips that help you also get to the next level. Like the first one that you alluded to in your previous answer, like optimizing for prioritizing the problem rather than the solution, is maybe something PMs need to pick up at a relatively early stage. But the art of building a narrative and a story that has a what, why, and context to get people to buy in is, I guess, the next stage of good product management, because it helps PMs convince others to buy in, and that then builds a sense of trust and gives you that longevity. It gives you the time to experiment, and you often need that time, especially when you're building new products or trying something that might not be very intuitive. Then you want that goodwill behind you to give you that room to operate. And then a more micro, but also a macro perspective of this is just being very, very rigorous and involving people in that decision, in having an answer. And it could be a data driven or a data informed answer. It could be qualitative. It could also just be logic. If you don't have those, like often early stage product development can just be, hey, I think this is a good idea for these 3 reasons, but not basically shooting from the hip, or not giving the impression that you're shooting from the hip, is important in circumstances like this, where people trust that, yeah, it's thought about, this person's probably given this the level of analytical rigor it deserves. It's not a knee-jerk reaction to a certain event that might have happened.
Yeah. And if you can't apply the level of analytical rigor that you would like at a certain point in time, it's good to just call it out. Like, if we had more time, or if we had a larger data set, or if we had if X or Y was in place, then maybe we would have actually been looking at this kind of data to make this decision, but we don't have that right now. And I think not making a decision is not an option. So I think like being decisive is critical. And so I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, I from what I've noticed, this also helps sometimes unblock certain conversations and to some degree influence people who can help you action on those decisions. Like if you created a scenario that, hey, if I had the resources, I would also do this first, for instance, or if you could run a survey, we do this, then potentially the person you're pitching to, it might be someone senior, it might be a peer in a different division who controls your UX research resources. They then have the ability to say, okay, yes, you know what, it's worth investing in, because it'll help us get a much more informed answer before we invest a lot of engineering time into this. So again, having that thought out and having that planned also protects you against, like, have we thought about doing a survey before we invest and go all into this direction? So yeah, these are like really good perspectives. But taking it from what you've articulated right now, like these are like these are how skills in terms of how to succeed. I want to take this into the very specific nuance of interviews, right? Because effectively in an interview, a PM has 45 minutes and is trying to demonstrate a host of competencies in that very narrow time frame. What could be good ways to demonstrate, like, your ability to tell stories, your ability to build, like, say, get people to buy into your ideas and invest that degree of analytical or whatever rigor into your decisions? What are some good tactics to demonstrate this within an interview?
It's a really good question. And I think that, again, different companies, I think you can interview, or you can survey maybe 100 different companies on how they approach PM interviews. And I think you might get a lot of different answers around this. I'm sure you probably already know this because you help people prepare for these interviews. But at a place like Facebook, it's very straightforward. It's like there's a leadership and drive interview, there's a product sense interview, and there's an execution interview. And there's a very specific set of signals that they're looking for out of each of those. And I'd be happy to talk through those if you're interested. And then I will say that the interview process at Attentive was very similar in a lot of ways to the Facebook one. So maybe Facebook's onto something. I have some friends at Google that I actually have gone through the full Google interview process myself, and I have friends that interview a lot of people there. It sounds like Google has some commonalities with how Facebook approaches the interview process as well. Yeah. My sense is like when you get to like the Amazons of the world is where it starts kind of like changing a lot. Maybe Netflix and Apple and Amazon have a completely different way of doing it than Facebook and Google. But at a place like Facebook, I think it's, if I had to like bootstrap an interview process for PMs, I think the Facebook one is probably as good as any for just bootstrapping one. Because I think it covers like the real dimensions that make you successful at Facebook. And I think Facebook is a very good product management culture. So if you can be successful as a PM at Facebook, I have a lot of like respect for you. And I think I've earned a lot of respect from other people by being a successful PM at Facebook when I was there. So I think there's something to that. It's not just noise. The leadership and drive element of the Facebook interview process is all about, that's the only one of the 3 interviews that goes into your actual experience. And your stories. So to prepare for those kind of interviews, I think what's really critical is to do a lot of like journaling and reflection on your experience, and to write down 1 or 2 key stories or key projects that you remember from each of those experiences that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay. So often we might inherit a project that has this huge win at the end, and you want to tell that story because it's got like an awesome ending, and maybe it even has an awesome middle, but your ability to articulate the beginning of the story is awful because you weren't there for it. So I think the best stories for interviews and these kind of leadership and drive settings are where you were there for the inception of the story, and like you can understand the context that led to the thing even happening. And then you can describe the action, like the middle of it, and what went down, and then the aftermath, like, okay, how did this all play out, and like what happened at the end, right? Those are, you're guaranteed to get asked questions about what happened then, right? Like if you're telling a story in an interview. So like don't tell stories that you don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end for, is like one very specific piece of advice I have. The second one is like you want there to be some action in the story. Like if it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, but there's no like drama, or there's no complication, or there's no thing that actually tested you or you learned something from, it's not going to help the interviewer get some kind of signal. And what the signal that they're looking for is like, does this person honestly reflect on their failures? Do they reflect on their mistakes? Do they reflect on feedback that they've received and had to give, and thinking of ways they can do it better next time? Like do they make the same mistake over and over again? Or are these the kind of people that can make a mistake and learn from it and not make that mistake again? And are they the kind of people that get other people excited about doing the work? Right? Like that's the leadership and drive element of the leadership and drive interviews. Like, can you get people to potentially have difficult conversations with you, but come out better because of it? Right. So that's the kind of stuff, the leadership and interview, leadership and drive interviews, it flies by, I think, faster than the rest of them because you're actually like super present with your own stories and your own memory. And you're trying to like, be honest. The people that fail the leadership and drive interview are people that think that it's like a trick interview where they say they want you to be honest about your failures, but they really don't. Those are the people that fail the interview. Like the people that do really well in the leadership and drive interview are the people that actually take it seriously, and they reflect, they show like a real ability to like reflect and introspect and think about how they can do things better. The product and sense interview is a lot more about your ability to take a open-ended, vague question, like I think, some of the interview prep that you probably do around like, how would you improve the group travel experience is one that there's a bunch of articles on like Google or whatever. Yeah. You're supposed to fill like 45 minutes of conversation on that question, and you're supposed to drive the conversation. Okay. So the meta skill that, I know it's called meta now, but the meta skill at a place like Facebook, now Meta, if you get asked a product sense interview question, is they want to see that you can drive the conversation.
Yeah.
They don't want you to wait for them to pull you along. So I think you have to demonstrate that you can drive a conversation. Some people take it too far and they kind of get aggressive in the interview. And like, if you try to pause them and ask them questions or nudge them along, they see that as like obstacles that they need to like shoot down. And those people don't succeed in the interview either. So there's kind of like a sweet spot where you're driving the conversation, you're keeping it moving along, you're keeping time in mind. Think of it like a meeting that you're running. Like there's an agenda, you have to get through the whole agenda, you have to do it within the time frame, and you have to do it in a way that the other person feels like they were part of the conversation and included. And you ultimately do need to cover, demonstrate you understand the problem, demonstrate that you can think about the audience and prioritize the problems that audience might face, and then brainstorm some solutions. And actually at the end, maybe come up with like a interesting product idea that's supposed to solve a problem. And it's something that you didn't think about before the interview. It's like you're demonstrating that you can get there through conversation in real time. So there's a certain level of like firepower that you need to demonstrate creatively. And then the execution interview is all about, how do you measure success for something, right? It's like, or how do you troubleshoot and debug something? Like you're looking at a chart, the numbers are going down, you have no freaking idea why it's happening. Like what kind of questions do you ask to dig into the source of truth? Like how do you get to the bottom of it? But then assuming, that's like usually like, it's like a curveball that you throw during the execution interview is like a debugging question. But the main kind of question I used to ask people is like, how would you, like, let's say you're a PM at Spotify and you're responsible for the consumer experience. How do you measure success?
Yeah.
So it's like just trying to get a sense for how you break that down into something that I could actually like see, like it's reasonable, right? And I can ask questions and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, these are very helpful tips, I guess, from someone who's been through the process themselves and knows a bit about it, because there's a lot of theoretical knowledge out there on what you'd want to cover, but relatively little guidance on what to actually do in that interview. Like good insight, for instance, on you have to drive it, but you also have to use it as an opportunity to accept feedback, reach a conclusion, reach an end state, surface all those competencies expected of you in that interview. So there's a lot to kind of get done. But yeah, good insight. Thanks for sharing. I have just one last question on this whole skills and interview and tips space. If you could give just one tip to someone who is, say, preparing for a product manager interview, and you, for instance, don't know which product role in which company and which process they're preparing for, what would it be?
I think I always hate when I have to just give one if I have a couple.
I know. Hashtag prioritization, Ben.
No, I'll give you a couple. I think one of them is about, remember that it's a two-way conversation. I tell this to anyone who's interviewing anywhere, and it's important to remember in the PM interview too. It's like they're interviewing you. Generally speaking, you have to impress them first, but then you need to ask them your questions after you get the offer. Yeah. So remember that it's a two-way dynamic. It's not, they don't have all the power. Like you are, like, this is a candidates market that we're in right now. So remember, like, don't get intimidated, approach it confidently, know that you have something to offer, especially if you get the offer at the end, you can ask your questions. The other thing I would just say is like, be yourself, like, show up like fully on the interview and be present and like say what you're actually thinking, and don't try to say the thing that you think they want to hear from you, because it can come off as like really inauthentic. These people talk to people all day who they work with, who are not trying to be anyone but themselves. And then they're going to get on an interview with you between their work calls, and they're going to be able to see your bullshit from like a million miles away. So they're just like, be honest, be yourself. Like they'll enjoy the interview more if you're just like a real person. So those are just like a couple that I think are important to kind of get into the right mind state, regardless of which company you're interviewing with.
Yeah. And I guess the trick to being yourself is also not to overinvest into one single interview, because that forces a sense of like tension on you, because if your own expectations are too high, it's very hard to be yourself, be honest, be candid, show that, hey, I did stuff and learned from it, or okay, I'm going to approach this as any product problem that I would in my day to day. And then it takes on a whole meaning of itself, which then makes you nervous, it makes you stutter, it makes you tense about, am I saying things the right way, am I saying the right thing, and so on.
The best interviews that I interviewed probably like 30 product managers when I was at Facebook. And I think that the best candidate, like the interviews that went the best from my perspective as an interviewer, were the ones where it felt like an actual conversation amongst peers. Like, this is someone who's taking time out of their day to talk to me. And I was like, oh, like, we'd be lucky to have this guy working, or this guy, or this woman working at Facebook, because they feel like I can already see them fitting in. Like, I think they could be successful just through the conversation. Yeah. So that's the kind of vibe. You want it to be like very conversational, very collegial, still demonstrate that you could bring me along for the ride. Like, I want to follow you in the interview. I don't want to drive it. I want you to drive it. But, and then the other thing is, like, if someone nudges you in an interview at a place like Facebook, they're doing you a favor. Like, listen to them. Like, they're not going to nudge you to trip you up. Like, they're nudging you because you're not going and necessarily like giving them what they need. So like, listen to them if they nudge you.
Yeah, no, there could be a host of reasons. You might be going down a tangent which they might already have explored. So they're like, hey, I know you can do this. Now let's talk about that instead. Or maybe they want to assess you to something, and the only progression is to get through that particular topic. So indeed, like, take these hints. Don't treat them like a challenge as much as like a guidance in which direction to move in, I guess is what you're trying to say.
Yes.
No, thanks. Good. Thank you so much for taking out so much time today, Ben. It's been really great catching up with you. And I honestly, all of us, not just me, but our audience as well, really appreciate how candid you were with your advice, drawing upon your own experience, but also giving people really actionable tips, both for succeeding in a product role, but also for succeeding in a job interview related to the product role if they choose to go down that route. Yeah, thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. And I hope your audience finds some value in this, and otherwise we'll do it again soon.
Yes, look forward to it. Cheers, Ben.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe. Our website is prepfully.com. We've got lots of interview questions there. You can also schedule a mock interview with one of our experts. You can find the link in the description below. All the best from us at Prepfully, and we hope you totally rock your interview.